Okay, I think we're going to get started. Hi, I'm Jennifer Gunn. I'm the director of the Institute for Advanced Study, and I want to welcome you all today to IAS Thursday and also the Retzel Lecture Series. And before I turn this program over to Jeannie Kildee, the director of the Religious Studies program, to introduce today's speaker, I just have a couple of announcements. One of them is to say, if you'd like to receive more information about the Institute for Advanced Studies programs, please sign up on this side of the lobby. There's a sign-up sheet. Also, following this presentation this afternoon, there will be a reception in the gallery just down and around to the right as you exit the theater, and you will notice a new exhibit that has just gone up on the history of the Northrop Auditorium organ. Next week, IAS Thursday is Professor Annie Morris from Hampshire College talking about incandescent alphabets, language transformations, and art in psychosis. And this will be downstairs, so same time but different place, in the Crosby Seminar Room at 3:30. And this is a joint presentation of the IAS and the IAS's Research and Creative Collaborative on Narrative Medicine, as well as co-sponsored by the Department of Art, Psychology, Psychiatry, and the Writing Studies program. There are a couple of upcoming events and exhibits that I just wanted to tell you about. Registration is now open for the Grand Challenges Research Expo, which will be an all-day event in Kaufman Union on April 18th. And you can go to this web address to sign up and find out more about the speakers and topics and related events. There's a new exhibit in the IAS windows downstairs on the second floor that comes to us from the courtesy of the Journalism School on political cartoons, specifically on her block. And on the west side is a display of her block cartoons on democracy, and on the east side is a display of her block cartoons on the presidents. So I hope you will avail yourself of that. So without further ado, let me turn this over to Jeannie Kildee to introduce today's speaker.
Thank you. Welcome, everybody. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the 2018 Retzel Family Lecture in Religious Studies. This is the 6th in a series of nearly annual lectures in religious studies that we launched in 2011 and that have been made possible by the generous support of Calvin and Caroline Retzel. And many other donors as well. And we're very grateful to all of you for your donations to this lectureship. I want to thank the Institute for Advanced Study and Jennifer Gunn for partnering with us again on this lecture in what's kind of become a tradition now. And I want to particularly thank Brianna Manning, Karen Kinoshita, and Christina Collins of the IAS for their work and help in making this all happen. I also want to thank the Department of History and American Studies for their additional support and co-sponsorship of the lecture today. In our audience today, we're privileged to have two former Retzel lecturers with us. Jim Stewart, Professor Emeritus of Macalester College, and John Butler, Professor Emeritus of Yale. This is a kind of special year for us, as our theme today is experiences and lectures, or experiences and narratives of the Great Depression. And it is a theme that not only has historical, but also personal significance for us. On the personal side, it's my privilege to announce the very recent publication of Cal Retzel's memoir of the Great Depression, I Knew We Was Poor. Just came out. The picture by his, was the drawing by his daughter on the cover. Available on Amazon right now. I Knew We Was Poor. And this is a book in which Cal weaves together stories and poetry to present a vivid child's perspective on Southern farm life during the 1930s. Cal's topic, and more specifically his title, links us to our speaker today, Dr. Alison Collis Greene, who explores the historical significance of the inverse of his title, We Didn't Know We Was Poor. In her 2016 book, No Depression in Heaven, Religion and the Great Depression in the Mississippi Delta, published by Oxford University Press, and here's a copy of her book, came out in 2016. We do have flyers on the desk out here for a 30% off the book from Oxford. In this book, Professor Greene, Alison, deftly and compellingly unpacks this more common articulation, we didn't know we was poor, and describes it or unpacks it as part of a broader, nostalgic, racially, socially, and politically instigated Christian narrative about the Depression that emerged in the late 1930s and into the 40s. Alison, in her historical study, and Cal, in his personal narrative, counter and expose the complicated history behind this long-articulated platitude. We didn't know we was poor. Alison Greene is well located to help us understand the historical processes at play within Southern Christianity of this era. Her book, No Depression in Heaven, won the Charles S. Sidner Award for a distinguished book in Southern history from the Southern Historical Association. As well, she also won a Choice Outstanding Academic Title distinction as well. The book earned honorable mention for the Deep South Book Prize awarded by the Francis Summersell Center for the Study of the South. Alison has published articles in the Journal of Mississippi History, Church History, and the Journal of Southern History, and she has also published a number of chapters in collections. She earned her PhD in history from Yale University in 2010, where she worked with John Butler. I just learned that. That's so cool. And she is currently an associate professor of history at Mississippi State University. But she will soon be moving to Atlanta, having accepted a new position at the Candler School of Theology at Emory University. While Professor Greene's topic is Southern history and her focus is on the lower Delta region of the Mississippi River, I hope you will all join me in extending a warm, if snowy, upper Mississippi welcome to Alison Collis Greene.
Thanks so much for coming out. It's really just a special honor to be here to give a lecture in Calvin Retzel's name. Dr. Retzel wrote to me last summer with some kind words about the book, and then he told me some of his own story and shared chapters of the memoir with me. I didn't know when I wrote my title that the book was actually called I Knew We Was Poor, but that's even better. Maybe we should stand up here and debate this. I think in the end we actually come to some very similar conclusions. I want to start with an excerpt from the memoir. In the relationships farm life fostered, you wrote, I felt loved, secure, and never hungry, but could I then say, as many now say of life in the Great Depression, we didn't know we was poor? The short answer is an emphatic no. Even with all the benefits offered in my family experience, I nevertheless knew we was poor. And that's a powerful corrective to a narrative of blithe and benign poverty. And even though Dr. Retzel's claims and mine look contradicting in the title, we didn't know we was poor is the title of my introduction rather than the book. And in that title, I'm quoting my grandmother. And I think, in fact, that Dr. Retzel's childhood and my grandmother's were strikingly similar, even though their adulthoods were not. My grandmother stayed home in the North Carolina Appalachians where she grew up and where I also grew up, and she spent her working years there in a textile mill. Dr. Retzel, of course, built the remarkable career that all of you know. But both of them would understand my bemusement every time I flew from the small airport where I live in Starkville, Mississippi, when I had the infinite good fortune of sitting on almost every plane flight for 5 years next to a middle-aged white man with family from the Delta who would ask me what I did and then tell me what I didn't know about it. And what I didn't know about it was that his parents, whoever this particular man was, and his grandparents' generation didn't know they was poor. As my grandmother would have said it, poor. That in fact there wasn't a depression in rural Mississippi because farmers could always take care of themselves. Now, at the same time that I was hearing these stories, I was spending a lot of time with letters and records of the Depression in rural Mississippi and Arkansas, and my evidence told me something very different from the folks I sat next to on the airplane. So did my own family's story, but I didn't know all of that story then. My grandmother's "we didn't know he was poor" was in part a reference to her own shame at her lack of education and status. We just didn't know. That part I knew. But it was most of all a recognition that others suffered a whole lot more than she did. She never went hungry, but the man that she would marry did. In the 1920s, his father, my great-grandfather, sent his own elementary school-age sisters to an orphanage because he couldn't afford to feed them, even with his job in the feldspar mines. My great-grandfather thought that he could retrieve his sisters when things got better, but things got worse. These were his siblings. He also had 3 children in the household. Another sister who was not admitted to the orphanage because she had congenital syphilis and so was ineligible because she was chronically ill. One day when my great-grandmother was away running an errand with one of her own children, her husband's 3rd sister fell into the kitchen's open fireplace and burned to death. The living sisters spent the remainder of their childhood 4 hours away, never again to live with members of their own family. I knew about those sisters, but I didn't know about the one who died. I didn't learn anything about her until I'd finished a PhD in history and written a book about religion and the Great Depression. My family joked for my entire childhood about all the moonshining preachers and married cousins in our family tree, but no one told this story of desperate poverty and suffering. So I tell it now to say this: stories full of pain and sorrow and shame too often die with those who bear them. It is in part why your book is so important and why I hope all of you will read it. If I plug one book today, I plug Dr. Retzel's. We learn tidier versions of our histories instead. And those stories, in turn, shape our ideas about the world and where we fit in it. If we don't learn about the suffering in our own worlds and our own histories, then we often fail to see it in others. Or worse, we blame them for it. And here's one of the best examples I can find of that. This came across my Facebook page around the same time that the book was coming out, and I think this represents a lot of the narratives that we get of the Great Depression. This idea that all you had to do was just do it. That Grandma's standing alone here, right? There's nobody else in this picture. Grandma doesn't need anybody except maybe her community. I'm going to leave this up and talk about the narrative that leads us to this. First, I'm going to talk about the problem with that narrative, which is that suffering, and most especially the suffering born of poverty, thus becomes a problem of the individual or of the community instead of a social or a political or an economic problem. When one of the richest countries in the history of the world also has one of the highest wealth gaps and among the highest rates of child poverty and homelessness and incarceration, we blame the poor, the homeless, and the incarcerated, or we blame the government's efforts to mitigate the suffering. Americans have a long history of blaming the poor for their problems, but it wasn't always so. The Great Depression brought such quick and deep suffering that it rendered visible the costs of capitalism and the systemic causes of poverty, and it united Americans around the notion that a federal response, a federal safety net, represented a moral imperative. If you want to tear away the safety net, then you have to tell a new story about the Great Depression. One that goes something like this, that rationalizes this image. Here's the story. The greatest generation suffered through the ravages of the Depression, but they emerged stronger. Maybe Roosevelt helped put them back on their feet with works programs and Social Security, but then they pulled together and helped each other and themselves. So the Great Depression redeemed them. They suffered just enough to turn to God and to realize that they could help themselves and their own communities. They fought another world war and they won. They built cozy homes, they went to college, they raised families, and they went to church or synagogue every weekend. The greatest generation was independent and hardworking and grateful. But the social programs of the New Deal and the Great Society destroyed their descendants. The rest of us are a disappointment, coddled by the government, each subsequent generation lazier and greedier than the one before it. Does that sound familiar at all? So I came to call this narrative, which I heard over and over on airplanes, the myth of the redemptive depression. It recasts the greatest economic crisis of the 20th century as a simple morality tale, a purifying experience that brought people together and brought them to God, or it would have if only Franklin Roosevelt hadn't gotten in the way. It's a story that erases the suffering and the sorrow of the Great Depression. It's a story that negates decades of bipartisan effort to protect Americans from another Great Depression. It's a story that ignores the way the greatest generation rallied together to build a welfare state, which in turn enabled them to prosper, but not all of them equally. It's a story that emphasizes the experiences of the white middle class, but ignores the vast network of federal programs that enabled its rise. Home loans, which privileged whites and wrote out African Americans. Farm loans, which did the same. Social Security, which excluded agricultural and domestic workers. And the GI Bill. It's a story that renders incomprehensible the truth that middle-class whites benefited from federal aid at the expense of people of color, and especially of African Americans, who have historically received vastly fewer federal benefits and still do. So one of the most toxic elements of the myth of the redemptive depression is the argument advanced most fiercely in the welfare reform debates of the 1990s and spoken as obvious truth among many conservatives today, that the New Deal destroyed the careful and compassionate work of the churches and of voluntary associations, that it undermined Americans' innate compassion in favor of an impersonal and permanent welfare state that rendered the poor helpless and dependent. Take Speaker of the House Paul Ryan's claim, which he made as a vice presidential candidate at a Catholic university, a vice presidential candidate for the United States, made at a Catholic university in 2012, that rather than a basic entitlement of citizenship, the social safety net, and this is a quote, dissolves the common good of society and it dishonors the dignity of the human person. So Ryan and other conservatives frame this as a debate about who should do the helping. As evangelical radio host Carmen Fowler-LaBerge tweeted last year, programs for the poor, homeless, sick, old, and imprisoned are calling of church, not government. Now, no one really believes that churches would do what the federal government does or what it did, and that's the point. The case against the welfare state rests on two basic assumptions. The first is that poverty and suffering are individual failures and not flaws in our political or economic systems. And if this is true, then second, we don't need a welfare state that assures a baseline standard of living. We need charity, and churches and voluntary agencies should get to decide who deserves help and how much and under what terms, and generally those answers are not much and not much of anybody. So in other words, the moral problem is the poor and not the persistence of poverty. Now, if you peel back the myth of the redemptive depression, that narrative and that argument falls apart. So let's start with this mythic golden age up to and through the 1920s, when there was no federal safety net, when Americans were supposedly flush and well. If you really want to see the golden age of voluntary aid in its purest form, then you have to look at it in a place where public aid of any sort didn't exist. So I'm going to take you down the Mississippi River to Memphis and the Mississippi and Arkansas Delta. And I define this region, this is the upper delta. This is the part of the delta for which Memphis represents the urban center. So this is a single unified economic region. The region's population was more diverse than you might imagine. Wealthy planters and industrialists, who you probably can't imagine, poor factory workers and farmers, Protestants, Catholics, and Jews. Memphis in this period was about 10% Catholic and 10% Jewish. African Americans, immigrants, and whites. This makes it an interesting case study of the way that aid operated across lines of institution, geography, and race, and from the most rural outposts to the city center. And just to bring home the ways in which Memphis and the Delta saw themselves as a single economic region, this is a strip of postcards that the city of Memphis produced in the 1920s with Memphis cotton plantation, a very stylized image thereof right there in the middle. Memphis was the cotton market in this period. Now, and here's the Memphis skyline. Now, before I go on, I want to pause a minute, and I'm going to make you do a little bit of work and a little bit of thinking. So, imagine for a moment it's 1930. You have a small farm in the country or a little shop in town or in the city, you can pick. You have a family constituted however you'd like to imagine. You've always scraped by, but since the stock market crashed, prices have bottomed out, and now nobody's buying anything. You lost your savings in a bank crash. Your farm or your business has gone under, the bank has repossessed your property. Your family's hungry. Your partner just died of tuberculosis, and now you're sick too. Your family has no food, no money, and there's no work to be found. So here's the question that I want you to think about a minute. Where do you turn for help? And then where do you turn? And then where do you turn? So now I actually want you to find somebody to talk to about this for just a minute. I'm going to stop for a couple minutes while you talk about it, and then I'm going to call on you. So you better be ready. All right, I hear voices winding down, so I'll take that as my cue. Would anyone like to volunteer? Where would you go first? Family, yes, that is where folks were first expected to go. It's a Great Depression. Your family is wiped out. Now where do you go?
Probably like neighbors asking for connections if they have any support or by the day jobs.
Who do you think Who do you think your neighbors are?
People in the same situation.
They're often people like you. Yeah, not always, but very often. Oh, you got a little help from neighbors. Your kids are hungry again. You still can't find a job. Where do you go next? Church. Go to church. What church? Baptists are famous for their generosity. I grew up Southern Baptist, so I can say that. What church do you go to? Your own. Yeah, so that's where you're supposed to go first. Generally, your church will help you if they can. What's your church probably look like? It looks like you, yeah. So you're really suffering. Now, maybe you are middle class and you fell, and so your church can actually help you. Let's say you're poor to begin with. Your church has already helped everyone it can. Your church can keep the doors open. Now where do you go? Yeah, so this was a big option in the Depression, right? You got nothing else you can do in the countryside. You You get on the train or you start walking, you go to the city. What turns out happens is folks, you try to get off the train in Memphis, and people stand there and hand you a ticket somewhere else. Memphis stopped providing charity to anyone who wasn't a resident pretty early on. So did most cities. We only help our own, they would say. So now where do you go? You go west, yeah. So this is what a lot of folks do. What's out west? Farm labor, yeah. There's land. You're probably not going to be able to acquire it, but yeah, and turns out most of the land between you and the west is an environmental crisis, right? Is turned to dust. But you go to California, you go west, you try to work on a farm. What else do you do? So their domestic labor, especially in the South, is almost entirely racialized, right? And so one of the deepest consequences of the Depression is that when folks can no longer afford domestic labor, you're pushing out the poorest now, right?
Then you march to Washington to recover your debts in the First World War veterans.
If you happen to be a veteran, indeed, that is an option that some veterans pursued. Yeah, the bonus army. That's right. You march to Washington and you demand advance payment on the veterans pension. How's that go? Yeah, so there were a few other options, and I want to sort of lay them out. But I do think it helps to actually think about what those options would have looked like in this moment. So once you have exhausted your family and community resources, you might have some public options. If you lived in the Northeast or the Midwest, you'd have a lot more options than if you lived in the South or in the West. Yet in either case, the available resources were at best patchwork. If you were a veteran, you might have access to a state pension, provided in the South only to Confederates. Essentially, the South's only welfare program then was explicitly for whites only. If you were an abandoned or widowed mother, you might receive a few dollars of Mother's Aid, a program, the programs that emerged in states at the state and municipal level in the teens and 20s, designed to allow mothers deemed deserving, in other words, mothers who had been married and abandoned, not single mothers, and not mothers who had left their spouses for any reason whatsoever, but mothers who had been abandoned, to keep their children in the home rather than putting them in an orphanage. So these were small funds just for mothers. Now, in the Northeast, you could actually possibly keep your child home, if you only had one of them, with a Mother's Aid pension. In the South, Mother's Aid was generally limited to whites, available only in select cities, almost not at all in the countryside. There was one county in the Delta that provided Mother's Aid. And it generally amounted to $1 or $2 a month, so it didn't actually accomplish the intended purpose of allowing mothers to keep their children at home. For the sick, state and private charity hospitals were available, but it was really difficult to get a bed. And if you were really destitute, you could go to the poorhouse, where if you were deemed able and deserving, you could work the poorhouse farm in exchange for rudimentary accommodations, all of your independence, and all of your remaining worldly possessions, which you had to give up upon entering the poorhouse. Before the New Deal, that was the extent of public aid in much of the United States, though a few cities offered more. By 1930, 76% of total aid in the nation's largest 116 cities averaged $1.09 per person. That was 76%, that was public. In Minneapolis, in case you were curious, that was 70%. But in Memphis, our exemplar of private charity, that amount was only, the total was 55 cents per person per year. And the proportions reversed. 76% of that 55 cents was private. In the Delta, private aid was the only option. So what did that look like? Well, between the Civil War and the Great Depression, Protestant women's societies and home missions organizations built schools and hospitals and orphanages and settlement houses to reach the city's needy whites. They, of course, prioritized their own members. The more expansive Catholic and Jewish charities likewise served members of their own communities first, but unlike the Protestants, they also helped others outside their own religious communities. By the 1920s, these organizations united in Memphis and in most cities in a consolidated community fund that produced brochures, we're out of order here, like this, explaining where to send people for help. And if you looked at these brochures, you might think anybody who needed help just had to ask. Yet these agencies, if you look at this, focused on institutional and aid and moral guidance. So like there's lots of resources for pregnant girls and problem children. They also made it, they focused on institutional aid, and in doing so they made it very clear that no one was entitled to adequate nutrition or a home or to good health. Indeed, those things might spoil a willing worker. As the head of Goodwill Industries, then a Methodist organization, the progenitor of the Goodwill that we know now, as he put it in 1927, the first taste of charity is as dangerous as the first shot of dope. Now, this argument applied to all the poor, but most strenuously to African Americans in Memphis, who represented 40% of the city's population, but received less than 3 cents on the dollar on the aid that they paid into municipal and charitable coffers. So this is the Memphis Community Funds, and this is how their money is spent. And you see that tiny little sliver, 3 cents there, for what they called Negro welfare. And this was an agency that explicitly included African American agencies, who put in other words, more than they got out. So black churches, women's societies, and fraternal orders provided the only source of support for most African Americans. Families that faced chronic poverty and hunger, regardless of race or ethnicity, had almost nowhere to turn. In Memphis, only the Salvation Army offered a comprehensive soup kitchen. People in the countryside relied entirely on informal aid, or they went hungry, as state-level nutrition studies demonstrate. And I'm sorry, I got this one out of order, but that's what you're looking at here. Does anyone know the condition this child has? What's that? Rickets. Yeah. What can you tell us what rickets is?
Well, it's the deformity of the head.
Yeah. So his legs are bowed. It softens the bones. It's the result of a vitamin D deficiency. It renders the bones soft, and the skull sometimes enlarged, and in severe cases it causes significant intellectual disability. And another significant illness of hunger was pellagra, which is a result of a niacin deficiency, and it causes skin lesions, diarrhea, and dementia, and death. So these were widespread, as any state-level nutrition study in this period would show. And then, I'm just going to go back here to blank. And then disaster struck. So this is before things are bad. The 1929 stock market crash didn't immediately affect Memphis and the Delta, but a record-setting drought in the spring and summer of 1930 did. Cotton parched in the fields. Food crops shriveled alongside cotton, which actually is fairly drought-resistant, and farmers faced a long winter with neither food to store nor income for basic staples. Even those who had managed to put by a little money saw their savings disappear in a wave of bank failures, which also hit the region especially hard because of a bank in Nashville to which all the banks in the region were linked that went under. Even people who had managed to put by a little money then saw their savings disappear. So no one had a name for it yet, but this was the start of the Great Depression. Not everyone suffered. Nobody's starving in America, scoffed a Southern Methodist bishop on Christmas Day of 1930. And he went on to talk about how insignificant soup houses were because the real cause of poverty was moral rot. 9 days later, black and white farmers outside the town of England, Arkansas, banded together and marched into town demanding food. Their families were starving, and Americans were stunned because farmers were hungry. These events brought a fundamental change in the way that people talked about suffering, charity, and individual responsibility. And here's why. The private aid organizations that had proudly proclaimed their success at caring for anybody who really deserved help faced 3 simultaneous crises. First, the number of people who sought help skyrocketed really fast. Second, donations to charities and churches plummeted, and their savings vanished in the same bank failures that crushed farmers and the middle class. And last, the defense that many of the poor deserved their plight fell apart in the face of widespread economic and environmental crisis. Churches and charities tried to help. In December of 1929, the Salvation Army in Memphis had served 1,700 meals. The next winter, it served 5 to 10 times as many meals every single month. It drained its swimming pool to make room for homeless men and boys to sleep on pallets on the pool floor. But most agencies cut back, and many disbanded altogether. Churches fared worse than voluntary agencies, struggling just to keep their doors open. Between 1929 and 1932, national income dropped by more than 50%. Until 1933, remarkably, church giving actually held steady. So it drops by 50%, but not by more. But that still meant a 50% loss at the very moment that demands on church resources escalated. And the churches cut benevolent spending first, and they were pretty open about this. The president of the Southern Baptist Convention gave a talk in 1931 in which he said, "We're putting off the Lord's cause while we try to settle with our other creditors." So when the money ran out, the churches turned their spending inward, not outward. Denominations scrambled to maintain the programs that they valued most, but they cut corners. Orphanages, for instance, were the programs that they stuck to the longest. Orphanages housed a growing number of non-orphans. This was always one of the roles of orphanages. But now, orphanages increasingly house children whose parents simply could not take care of them. Even before the Depression, orphanages were inadequate, sometimes dangerous places. The Industrial Settlement Home was a church-supported African-American orphanage in Memphis. It burned to the ground in August of 1929. 8 young boys, ages 2 to 6, died huddled together in a bathroom. And when the mistress of the orphanage was asked if anyone was left in the orphanage, she said there wasn't, so there was no rescue effort. And in the subsequent investigation, it became clear that the children had died not of smoke inhalation or of burning, but because the bathroom had essentially turned into an oven. It also came out that the children had been sleeping in closets and bathrooms, which might have been why they were in the bathroom to begin with, and that the matron beat the children regularly with shoes and hot fireplace pokers. In fact, the fire was set by a young woman who she had just beaten. Similar episodes of abuse rocked the Mississippi Baptist Orphanage in Jackson in 1929 and 1930 when a grand jury indicted the superintendent for administering excessive corporal punishment. It takes a lot of corporal punishment to be indicted in Mississippi for excessive corporal punishment, even in 2018, let alone in 1930. In one case, the superintendent beat a 14-year-old girl with a board, stopping only when the board broke. And the only reason that this came to light was because her aunt came to visit, and the child couldn't get out of bed. She was bruised from shoulders to knees. The denomination immediately blamed the children for their unruliness, said, "We just need to stop having older kids here. They don't know how to behave." And only after congregations spoke out did the orphanage remove the director, months later. But the Depression left people so hungry that parents had to choose between letting their children go hungry and leaving them in orphanages rife with abuse and violence. And then, between 1929 and 1930, private aid collapsed altogether. Overstuffed orphanages turned kids away to starve, and parents didn't even have that choice to make anymore. The Great Depression revealed to religious leaders what they could ignore in the 20s and what Ryan and his colleagues ignore today, that poverty exacts a terrible price on families and on communities, that there is no dignity of the human person when that person lies dying alone of hunger or the many diseases of malnutrition and exposure, when that person cannot keep her children warm or safe, or, as in the case of my great-grandfather, when that person must abandon his own siblings so that they don't starve. As they faced the suffering before them and their own inability to alleviate it, religious leaders across the nation stopped talking about individual responsibility and charity. Now even Southern Baptists wrote about the failures of capitalism and about Americans' basic responsibilities to one another. It's really remarkable to look at old Southern Baptist publications and see one clergy person after another denouncing capitalism in every possible way. They called for the federal government to step in to protect its citizens. Americans had begun to conclude that a welfare state would not destroy human dignity. In fact, it would recognize and preserve human dignity. But the federal response came slowly. In January of 1932, President Herbert Hoover's administration provided emergency loans to banks and corporations and later to states and municipalities for public works projects. But it was too little, too late. Democrat Franklin Roosevelt trounced Hoover in the 1930 election. In case you're wondering what a trouncing looks like, this is it. And he did so on the promise that he would leverage the federal government to end the Depression, modeled in some cases on programs that he had first tried out as governor of New York. The barrage of legislation that Roosevelt signed in 1933 and what would become known as the first 100 days included the creation of the Federal Emergency Relief Administration, the very first program in American history to put federal funds not only toward employment relief, but also toward direct aid for those who suffered, although it was only in whatever form city and state aid administrators saw fit. In the South, in other places that actually could be direct relief, financial relief. In the South, it was most often food and jobs aid. Significantly, FARA and other New Deal programs prohibited explicit racial discrimination, but because of its local administration, local administrators very quickly found other proxies for racial exclusion. Federal aid quickly outpaced that of all private agencies because it could leverage a vastly larger pool of resources. Across the nation, but especially in places like Memphis and the Delta that had offered little aid to the poor, New Deal spending made previous private contributions look like pocket change. And here's the jump in aid from 1931, the last year, the deepest year of the Depression, from 1934, the first year when you see these programs in action. At the peak of private giving then in 1931, this is the worst of the Depression, but actually when private giving was at its best, Memphians raised 88 cents in aid per person, 75 cents of that private. By 1934, with the New Deal in full swing, Memphians received $7.21 per capita in aid for direct and work relief, only 12 cents of that private. So in just 5 years, federal dollars that provided work and food that Memphians needed almost completely replaced private aid, which dropped from nearly 3/4 of relief spending in the city to less than 2%. In the Delta, virtually all aid was public. Now, this might seem to support the argument that states had swept in to take over the church's work, but only if you forget that by 1933, the limited aid that churches had offered before the Depression was long gone. More significantly, New Deal programs shifted the emphasis from individual suffering to collective responsibility, from private charity to public welfare, an ideal that the Depression justified and that the New Deal reinforced. Unsurprisingly, liberal Protestants applauded FARA, as well as the National Recovery Administration, a program which for the first time acknowledged workers' rights to organize into labor unions. Many saw both programs as the realization of the social creed of the churches, a statement published in 1908 by the Federal Council of Churches. And I don't expect you to actually read this, but if you just glance over the social creed, you get a sense of the way in which the things churches advocated for were actually incorporated into the New Deal. Catholics linked New Deal programs to papal decrees regarding social justice and workers' rights. Jews pointed to the connections between the New Deal and the teachings of ancient Israel's prophets. Now, maybe more surprisingly, at least to the 21st century ear, conservative Protestants were equally enthusiastic. Many, in fact, declared that Roosevelt drew his inspiration straight from the Bible. "The Blue Eagle is now perched on my door," wrote one Southern Methodist in reference to the National Recovery Administration's symbol. That was the first NRA. "I have signed up for the war against the Depression," this minister said. The National Bible Press enthusiastically tracked the biblical allusions in Roosevelt's addresses. In fact, clergy complained mostly that the New Deal didn't do enough. FARA and the other 1933 programs curbed the crisis, but they did not establish a permanent welfare state. Roosevelt responded to those demands in 1935 when he signed the Social Security Act, which made provisions for the elderly, the orphaned, and the disabled. He also established the Works Progress Administration, which eventually created public works jobs for 8.5 million Americans. Upon the passage of both programs, Roosevelt reached out to clergy to assess their responses to the extension of a permanent federal safety net. And this is a really remarkable source, this is the letter that the Roosevelt administration sent to every clergy person they could find in the United States, and also published in newspapers in case they didn't find all the clergy people, and asked them to write back describing local conditions and their response specifically to Social Security and the WPA, although he also wanted to know about other programs. Over 30,000 clergy wrote back with overwhelming enthusiasm, and 12,000 of those responses arrived within 3 months. The letter was sent out in September, and the responses that came in by the end of November, December, were the New Deal administration, which is famous for counting everything, counted and cataloged the responses by their level of favorability. 84% of them completely or mostly approved of the New Deal programs. And the New Deal is assessing itself in this way, so I've looked at those letters and I've looked at what they counted as mostly approving, and it really is. Clergy wrote over and over that the welfare state represented a religious achievement, not an encroachment on the church's work, that in fact it freed them to focus on supplementary care or to return to a focus on evangelism. Now, of course, there were dissenters. Premillennialists included Roosevelt among a cast of possible antichrists, not too far behind Mussolini. And many white Southern conservatives, of course, worried that the New Deal would undermine Jim Crow capitalism. White Southern conservatives Democrats had a hand in creating the New Deal. They thought they could create programs that would maintain Jim Crow, and in many ways the New Deal reinforced economic inequality, but because it prohibited explicit racial discrimination in most programs, it also created a recourse for African Americans who were denied aid, and you see that happening in really large numbers. And so the very Democrats who had created those programs essentially sacrificed them on the altar of white supremacy. African Americans petitioned for protection from racist aid administrators, because still these programs are not equitable. Christian and Jewish socialists, lots of those in the South in this period, and quite visible and vocal, criticized the New Deal more than anybody because they wanted a president who would unmake American capitalism, not shore it up. Finally, some clergy worried that the federal government weakened the church's hold on Americans because it strengthened secular community institutions, but not religious ones. Public works projects might build a community center, but they weren't going to rebuild a church. So the New Deal consensus, despite this dissent, the New Deal consensus thrived for at least a generation. From the 40s to the 60s, both Republican and Democratic administrations expanded the welfare state and its protections for American citizens. When civil rights activists protested the unequal benefits that the welfare state provided to whites, Lyndon Johnson's administration responded with war on poverty programs designed to expand provisions for health and child welfare across racial and ethnic lines. It was a far from perfect effort, and it met with fierce resistance, but it represented the most equitable expansion of the welfare state to that point. But conservative repression of the civil rights movement and a backlash against federal protections for all Americans was already underway. By the 1980s, the war on poverty became what is aptly called the war on the poor, a renewed effort to blame the poor for their own suffering and deny them the very services that had proven an effective road out of poverty. 4 decades of efforts to both shrink and privatize the welfare state while expanding its punitive powers and erasing its efforts to close the gaps between rich and poor, black and white, new immigrant and established citizen, women and men, have resulted in another period of vast income inequality, unmatched now even by the 1920s. The work to dismantle the welfare state rested on the myth of the redemptive depression, a careful erasure and repackaging of the 20th century's greatest economic crisis. It's a myth that infuses Americans' contemporary faith in the voluntary and private sectors and their skepticism of the federal government. In the retelling, people who wanted assistance could always turn to their families or their churches until Roosevelt swept in to replace voluntary assistance with state aid that rendered its recipients hopelessly dependent. One of the most catastrophic moments in modern American life now turns into an idyllic world where deserving poor, left to their own devices, would find their way out of their misery with just a little help from their churches and absolutely none from the government. Gone from the myth of the redemptive depression are the years of suffering so deep and widespread that they left once hopeful Americans defeated and their churches and communities unable to come to their aid. Gone are the clergy bold enough to admit defeat and call for a social safety net that would prevent the next generation from dying of starvation and the diseases of poverty. Gone are the careful negotiations between church and state and the willingness to try new solutions to social and economic crises. When we accept fictional stories, false stories about our history, we misunderstand our present. We inhabit a nation steeped in white supremacy and in indifference to the suffering of our most vulnerable. But we are a nation of people, rural and urban, black and white and multi-ethnic, women and men, immigrant and native born. People who have found a sense of purpose in the midst of crisis before, who have stood in solidarity against impossible odds before. And so we now face, in this moment, an opportunity, an obligation to do so once again. Thanks.
We respond to questions.
Yes, yeah, I'm happy to.
Field them, or should I?
What's your preference?
If you're
I'm
comfortable.
perfectly fine, yeah. Yes?
About the 32 campaign, it seems to me both Roosevelt and Hoover campaigned on a balanced budget. Then a few years later, Roosevelt changed policies. I'm just reflecting that in a way their campaigns were similar.
There are certainly similarities between their campaigns. Roosevelt, the biggest mark against Roosevelt in the South was that he campaigned to fund lots of New Deal programs by ending prohibition, whereas Hoover was, as one Methodist put it, amphibious. He refused to take a position, wet or dry. But in 1937, of course, Roosevelt does try in some way to balance the budget, and you get the recession of 1937 as a result.
I'm very interested, excuse me, I've been reading a lot about the revival of the Poor People's Campaign.
Yeah.
And the whole idea of, one way or another, studying what Martin Luther King was saying at the end of his life when he's talking about the massive rearrangements of political and social power in order to be able to create change, and also say that poverty is colorblind. And so I'm interested in the racial twist that this thing takes in the narrative that you tell a little bit more, from the point of view of asking whether it is possible to find now that common element of self-interest that obviously is going through your talk the whole time. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I could talk a lot about the Poor People's Campaign, but I'm not a historian of it, only a fan. I think what's most striking about the Poor People's Campaign is the leader of the Poor People's, well, one of the many, it's sort of intentionally figureheadless, but one of the key leaders of the Poor People's Campaign is now William Barber, who was head of the North Carolina NAACP until he stepped down to, and the leader of the Moral Mondays movement in North Carolina, until he stepped down to work with the Poor People's Campaign, and that's his primary work now. And William Barber's critique is deeply focused on white supremacy and on the way in which white supremacy is, in the end, a way to divide the poor by race, by ethnicity, in every possible way. And as long as you keep the poor divided, then capital can have its way. So race is not only inextricable here, but it's sort of the key. And the Poor People's Campaign focuses on solidarity without reducing the way in which white supremacy disproportionately affects people of color, whether particularly poor people of color, which I think is a particularly remarkable thing about it. Does that address your question?
Could you go back even earlier than this period, like after the Civil War? The peculiar thing, and all our literature tells us, well, the slaves are freed, but freed without land, without assets, and
Indeed.
and without community, like you asked what to do when you've got nothing. What to do has plagued black people in the 1860s and 70s and 80s as well. What did they do?
So yeah, this is a story that could begin in many places, and that is probably one of the likeliest. So if you start during Reconstruction, you have a different answer to that question than if you start at the end of Reconstruction, right? So the one of the purposes of Reconstruction was for African Americans in the South to establish some sort of means whereby to start over. But most of the ways most of what a lot of folks thought was going to happen, provision of land, provision of some sort of income to start out, didn't happen, right? As a result of political wrangling. After Reconstruction, after the white South ends Reconstruction, in the period of redemption, you will often hear the narrative of people who stayed on their farms, right? Slaves who stayed on the farms where they worked. Well, they stayed on the farms where they worked because there wasn't much of an option. Still in this period, the white South, the elite white South, establishes a system of sharecropping, which is a negotiation they make with formerly enslaved people from a level of disproportionate power. And sharecropping, the idea was that sharecropping and the white version of it, tenant farming, which later get completely muddled together, would provide a ladder out of poverty. But when sharecroppers year after year, because farming is inherently unstable, and sharecroppers year after year would end the year with nothing, then mobility was limited. You have a series of black codes and then later versions of those that circumscribe movement of African Americans in the South, and you have convict leasing, which creates a new form of policing, and in the words of some historians, slavery by another name. And all of these systems are designed to keep African Americans in poverty and also from leaving the South, because if they leave the South, they are no longer a captive labor force, right? So yeah, so there's an inadequate response to this with the New Deal, to say the least, but there is actually attention to it. Yeah.
It's clear that part of the motivation and passion of your presentation are the analogies between what was going on then and what is going on now, and the current attempt to deconstruct a welfare state, and perhaps now the absence of any notion of redemptive suffering. Kind of a two-tiered question. Say a little bit more about the analogies that you see between then and now, and say also how that sense of injustice impacts your own work as an historian.
So it's an interesting comment. I started writing this book as a dissertation in 2006. Is that right, John? And I, at the good advice of John Butler and the other members of my committee, paid absolutely no attention to what was going on in the present moment. And in 2006, frankly, it didn't seem all that relevant. In fact, wasn't sure anybody would ever care about the Great Depression. And then in 2007, people suddenly did. And in 2008, people cared even more, right? Because they're in the middle of a recession, and suddenly my project got way more interesting than I ever thought it would be. But I actually really doubled down on not thinking about any connections between what I was doing then and what we were living. When I started the project, I wasn't trying to talk about church and state so much as about what happens in this moment of suffering to religion in a very poorly defined and abstract kind of way. What I kept finding was people talking about the state and the state's responsibility in every religious publication and every sermon that I looked at. Starting about 1931, after basically failure to acknowledge depression was happening at all from 1929 to mid-1931. And then I finished the dissertation, doesn't talk about any of this stuff. I had read way too many books where a historian wrote a really short epilogue that covered 40 years or 100 years, and I said, I'm never doing that. And then I got on these airplanes, and I got lecture after lecture about the Great Depression, and the story of the Great Depression over and over and over was this story of redemption. And Franklin Graham gave a spiel to Christiane Amanpour in an interview in which he said, everything was fine. If you needed a job or something, you could just go to your church, and the government took it away from the church. And I thought, what is going on? And so I came home one evening when I was trying to finish the book, tired from the last lecture on an airplane, and I sat down and I tried to write out what was going on, and I did. I wrote this epilogue I vowed I would never write in one angry evening. But really, I was trying to make sense of these stories I kept hearing, and I knew there was some connection between those stories and the research that I was doing. It actually took me a really long time to make the connection. And actually, since the book came out, I probably make it more than I did when I was writing it, even when I was finishing the book, especially in this current moment and talking about the budget and the way that people talk about the welfare state, the way people talk about the individual causes of poverty and suffering. And the Depression is a striking moment because it's the moment when you couldn't do that anymore. It just completely fell apart. And so you have to erase that story to tell the one we have now. You have to forget a generation of suffering. And the only people remaining who lived it, right, are people who can write memoirs of their childhood. There are few people left who are adults in the Depression, right? And I think that's significant. And again, why the story of your childhood is so important. Yeah.
Well, I just want to thank you. This is such a beautiful lecture and a beautiful statement of the realities of that period. And I hear modern statements by politicians that poverty is a mindset, and that no matter how much help you give the poor, they can rise a little bit, but the moment you quit giving them help, they're going to be right back. So it doesn't do any good to help them. And I just think that this is such an important narrative to help us better understand the precarious nature of human life and the interdependence of human life. And I think also of the importance women played just in survival, really, that is not often included in the narrative. So I just want to thank you.
That last is such a powerful point because even the little bit of charity that was happening was almost entirely the work of women in this period.
Absolutely.
Just overwhelmingly. One of the things that's really striking is that when clergy start to critique the New Deal, one of the things they want is to administer it in their own churches. And they even will say things like, the women's societies have been trying to take over, but if you let me be the person to stave off the wolf from the door, right, then we can reestablish order in the churches. So there's a patriarchal element to this critique too, right? The ministers saw the New Deal. They thought they could get in on the scheme, right, and sort of push the women's organizations out.
The myth that you refer to, at what point there's got to be a shift in collective memory of this is how it was. I remember 2008, so I can remember exactly how crappy it was, but in 10, 20 years, there's going to be another myth around it that comes out of the collective memory. At what point does this myth, I know you just put a frame on it, does that start to become the more accepted version of, because you talk about hearing all these stories from these they got those stories from
Yeah.
somewhere. So where did those stories originate? And it has, to me, it strikes me as that something it has to do with the way you remember, a collective memory and a personal family memory.
So I could map 3 points, and I'll try to do that fairly briefly. The first is in the 40s and 50s, you get a coalition of conservative business people and clergy. My grad school friend Sarah Hammond wrote about them in a book called God's Businessmen. And I don't think I realized when I was writing it how much our books would connect. But what they do is they start to create this narrative. And it doesn't win for a long time. But it gains traction in the Great Society when the extension of the welfare state makes a lot of white people nervous because they are no longer its sole or primary beneficiaries, although they really were. And then in the 90s, the welfare reform debate, when once again there's a racialization of poverty that had begun before, but really takes root again with the welfare queen image. In that welfare reform debate, there's a historian, Marvin Olasky, who wrote a book called The Tragedy of American Compassion, and he advances, the paragraph I read is like a summary of his book, basically. And that, I think the 90s are when a narrative that people sort of scoffed at for a long time, but was there, really takes root. And so it is a matter of collective memory, but as a result of very particular and intentional exercises of power.
Can you comment about the role of immigration in the pre-Depression era? I'm thinking especially in the Northeast, the immigrant churches that grew up to serve these different immigrant groups and how their social service networks affected extreme poverty during the Depression.
Oh, that's a great question. The book that introduced me to this topic was Liz Cohen's Making a New Deal. And that's what it's about. It's about the ways in which before the Depression, workers could rely on immigrant churches and on their various societies. It's focused on Chicago. And then those things kind of fall apart in the 1920s as a result of sort of disingenuous welfare capitalism, but also this crisis. And so she has, Catholic immigrant societies are particularly successful, for instance. And that is, when I ask you where you turn, if you are an immigrant, you turn to your ethnic community. And there are plenty of immigrants in this region, too. There's a large Syrian population in the Delta, and then there are waves of immigration in the Delta that are the result of Delta planters trying non-black plantation labor. So there's Italian immigration, a wave of Italian immigration, a wave of Chinese immigration, and then a wave of Syrian immigration. It never works, but so you get this happening there too, essentially. And so these ethnic aid societies work really well until they don't in the same kind of moment. The conversations about poverty, even in this period, are racialized, and when those immigrant populations are categorized as non-white, right, then they're responsible for their poverty and their suffering. And so, like the Chinese in the Delta are a good example. They learn to identify and to be accepted as white. And essentially, this is an immigrant story that happens over and over. When immigrants become white, they get the benefits of white supremacy, and they sort of turn their back on the communities of which they, were once part, and they become part of the racialized narrative of poverty as a result. Is that?
I imagine there's a connection with today's situation a little bit too. same dynamics going on.
Yeah.
I want to thank you for this talk, which was really, frankly, moving and wonderful. And I'm curious about, I love your story about, your airplane lectures. And I'd love to know if you've ever sort of decided to lecture back. And then, but also sort of more generally about reception that you've gotten for this talk. This is sort of a more academic setting. I don't know if you've presented this material, among sort of, for conservative groups, conservative Christian groups, people who sort of, maybe like agree with Paul Ryan. And I was struck by the little, I forget what those
The meme.
The memes, yeah. You know, like how you would sum up, like, you know, the way in which these memes are so, you know, like we all kind of recognize that argument that you were talking about at the beginning, but you know, how to counter that with something, because your talk is both moving, but it's also, you know, a complex story. Um, but so I guess this is just in general a question about like how you've gotten the word out about this alternative history, which is so important for people, especially now, to understand.
Yeah, that's a great question for which I'm not sure I have a great answer. It's an academic book. I wouldn't say the word is out. But yeah, I mean, I teach at Mississippi State, so this is probably the most sympathetic audience I've ever had. Every talk I've given, maybe the New York Council of Churches actually was quite sympathetic as well. Otherwise, I've basically talked about this in the Deep South. And I don't, I mean, it's not like, I give a range of talks, but y'all are not my world. My world is people who disagree with me and who tell these stories, and that's why I care about it. So yeah, I mean, I sit on a plane next to folks. I'm not a combative person by nature, but the thing I was told as a child not to do is ask questions, and so that's what I try to do. I ask them questions about their stories, and I keep asking them questions about their stories, and ask them questions about the inconsistencies in their stories, because I figure this works better with my students than telling them. I tell them some of this stuff too, but I want them to disagree with me, and our students are too passive and quiet, and when they speak up and they tell me why they disagree, then I don't know, we can have a conversation. And I mean, I care a lot about this. I think they're wrong, but I don't think I'm going to convince them of that. I think I can ask them questions that at least, like, tell me about your grandfather's experience. Did your grandfather's family have a mule, a plow, a farm? What did they do when somebody came to the door who didn't? And did you know anyone who went hungry? And what do you think happened to them? And I don't know, maybe a pretty mealy mouth sort of half response, but it's maybe I've read too much bell hooks, but that's sort of my approach.
Just a response to what you said 3 or 4 seconds ago, I don't think it's a mealy mouth response, because you really can't argue with people who really fail, this may sound pompous, but who fail to be compassionate. And I don't think it's a coincidence that the failure of compassion that we see nowadays and the stench that's coming out of the White House coincides with true oppression of public education, and a total disregard for the environment. I think all of those are probably connected. I'm just going to speculate and say connected at their roots with a really diseased failure of compassion. One of the great sources of compassion, of course, is knowing people who are suffering, but it's also a good understanding of literature. And having done a certain amount of volunteering in the public schools and teaching also, people don't understand a lot of what is happening in good literature that is about compassion and truly understanding in some strange way, I think it's kind of mystical, what's happening in the minds and hearts of other people. It's a sense that we really have. It's a capacity, and it's very easy for that to shrivel, especially when you watch too much CNN. I mean, it's really, so I think what you're doing is not mealy-mouthed at all. It's maybe the only thing we have, is to start asking questions that would ask people to think about what compassion is.
I appreciate that.
Yeah.
I think you're. I think yeah. I mean, I think that while it's fair to say that sort of education and knowing things intellectually is inadequate, it's which is a sort of, something you'll commonly hear on the left. I mean, I grew up with lost cause mythology. I grew up believing a lot of the things I'm telling you now, and I needed to be asked questions, and I guess to make a really bad pun, I don't think most people are lost causes, and I think that I don't always know how to sort of get there. I mean, I do know that my students in classrooms in Mississippi, I mean, more than anything, need permission to ask questions about the world that they live in, and if that means that they start with questioning me as the relative authority in the room, disagreeing with the stuff I say here, I don't know, I actually think that's kind of a start. So, yeah.
Well, thank you. That's a good, terrific lecture.
Thanks.